Hello, grounded Taurus. There may be a reason you feel more alert than usual around certain people or certain family dynamics, even if nothing dramatic has happened on the surface. Something you once considered secure may be looking different to you now, not necessarily because everything around you has suddenly changed, but because something within you has become less willing to confuse familiarity with safety. You may have spent a long time preserving a relationship, a family role, or a sense of peace, while quietly carrying the feeling that something important was no longer being honored. Perhaps the wound was never one obvious betrayal that everyone could point to and name. Maybe it was a series of small moments when promises stopped carrying the weight they once had, when someone's actions no longer matched their words, or when trust seemed to become useful to them only when it served their needs. You may have noticed these changes long before you felt ready to acknowledge them, because Taurus tends to watch what remains consistent over time rather than reacting to one isolated moment. And somewhere inside, you may have begun asking yourself whether you were protecting peace or simply becoming accustomed to carrying discomfort. What makes this especially painful is that there may have been another person close to the situation who saw more than they admitted. They may not have created the wound themselves, and they may never have openly chosen a side, yet their lack of support still left an impression on you. Sometimes silence carries its own weight, especially when it comes from someone whose loyalty you believed you understood. You may have found yourself wondering whether you were asking for too much, or whether you were simply hoping for the same kind of loyalty you had always been willing to give. For you, Taurus, betrayal does not have to be dramatic to change the way you feel inside a relationship. It can appear through an obligation that someone repeatedly fails to honor through effort that becomes expected rather than appreciated, or through years of giving that slowly turns into an unspoken assumption that you will always be there to handle what others leave behind. What hurts may not be the material thing itself, but what that action reveals about the value another person placed on your effort. You know what it means to build something slowly, protect it carefully, and give it enough time to become dependable. So discovering that someone treated what you created casually can reach much deeper than the surface event. You may have spent years creating a kind of emotional shelter for the people around you, solving practical problems, keeping promises, maintaining routines, and making sure there was something solid to return to when life became uncertain. That is one of your strengths, but it can also become a quiet burden when everyone assumes the person who can carry the weight should simply keep carrying it. You may continue functioning even while something inside you has become tired, guarded, or distant. And other people can mistake that continued competence for proof that you were never deeply affected. But the fact that you kept moving does not mean nothing changed within you. There are wounds that do not announce themselves through anger. Sometimes they show up as hesitation, as the moment you stop telling someone certain things, as the instinct to double-check what they say, or as the strange feeling that you can finally relax only when they are no longer in the room. You may still care about someone while no longer trusting them in the same way, and that contradiction can be difficult for a Taurus heart to accept. You value continuity, but continuity only has meaning when there is something trustworthy being continued. What some people call stubbornness may sometimes be your way of staying connected to what you know is real. You notice patterns, especially when a relationship begins to drift away from its own promises, and you may remember details that others would prefer to forget. Your patience allows you to give people more chances than they realize, but patience does not always mean that you are unaware of what is happening. Beneath that calm exterior is a quiet discernment, almost like knowing by the feel of the ground beneath your feet when something that once seemed firm has begun to shift. You may recognize this in the story of someone who spent years building a life around loyalty, responsibility, and trust, only to discover that a person close to them had not been holding those same principles with equal care. Perhaps the deepest loss was not money, property, or some practical resource, but the belief that shared values meant the same thing to both people. When that realization arrives, it can make you question more than the relationship itself. It can make you question the assumptions you used to decide who was safe enough to trust. And for someone like you, who tends to build slowly and commit deeply, that kind of uncertainty can feel far more unsettling than an ordinary disagreement. This is why you may have become quieter after what happened, Other people may have interpreted your silence as acceptance, forgiveness, or simply a return to normal, while inside you were conserving the little energy you had left for another confrontation. You may have decided that arguing would create more instability than it would solve, so you went back to work, handled your responsibilities, and continued being dependable because those were things you knew how to do. Yet there may still be a part of you asking why something you worked so hard to protect was not treated with the same respect you gave it. And this is where your deeper lesson begins to take shape, Taurus. You are allowed to ask whether the stability you have been protecting is actually nourishing you, or whether you have simply become very skilled at surviving inside it. There is a difference between remaining steady because something still has value, and remaining still because change feels too disruptive to contemplate. The same persistence that has helped you endure difficult seasons can sometimes keep you attached to a structure that has already changed, and recognizing that does not make your strength a weakness. Perhaps you will spend too much time measuring your own behavior against someone else's disappointment, wondering whether you were too serious about commitments, too firm about your boundaries, or too unwilling to overlook things that others considered insignificant. Maybe you softened yourself, gave more than you wanted to give, or stayed available because you hoped consistency would eventually bring the relationship back to what it once was. But understanding another person's limitations does not require you to abandon your own emotional truth. You can acknowledge that someone may have their own reasons, fears, or limitations without pretending that those things made the impact on you disappear. There may come a point when you stop asking, "Why did they do this to me?" and begin asking something much more useful. What am I choosing now? You may never receive the explanation that would make the past feel fair, and you may never hear the apology you once imagined would finally settle everything inside you. But your future does not have to remain dependent on another person's willingness to understand what they did. You can begin deciding what deserves access to your time, your trust, your energy, and your heart, without turning that decision into revenge. For Taurus, real healing may be quieter than people expect. It may look like no longer explaining the same boundary, no longer trying to convince someone of your value, or no longer confusing endurance with love simply because you have endured for so long. You do not have to destroy what came before in order to make room for something healthier. Sometimes you simply have to stop tending the part that has stopped growing. And as you become more honest about what actually makes you feel safe, you may begin to understand that stability was never meant to mean carrying everything alone. It was meant to give you enough ground beneath your feet to breathe, choose, and continue becoming who you are. So you went back to the things you knew how to do without having to think about them. You worked, handled what needed handling, kept your promises, and continued showing up when other people depended on you. You became dependable in the same quiet way you always had been. And because you were still functioning, some people may have assumed you had already moved past what happened. But Taurus, functioning is not the same thing as healing, and beneath that composed exterior, there may still be a much younger, more tender part of you, carrying one question that never really found a place to rest. Why was something you worked so hard to build treated as though it did not matter? Why did the effort, loyalty, and care you poured into your relationships seem so easy for someone else to dismiss? You may have buried those questions beneath errands, obligations, work, family responsibilities, and all the ordinary things that gave your days structure, until you could barely hear yourself asking them anymore. Yet some deeper part of you continued listening, because unanswered pain does not always disappear simply because life becomes busy enough to cover its voice. That is why this moment deserves your attention. It is not asking you to put your relatives on trial, rewrite your entire history around what they did, or turn old hurt into a permanent sentence against anyone involved. It is asking you to make room for the part of yourself that remained loyal, even while it was hurting, the part that kept trying to preserve connection long after it had stopped feeling safe to do so. You have spent enough time being the person who could carry difficult things quietly, and now that quieter part of you deserves to be heard without immediately being corrected, explained away, or told to move on. And Taurus, there are things your pain does not say about you. It does not mean you are difficult simply because certain promises matter deeply to you, and it does not mean your need for security makes you materialistic or overly attached to what you have built. Your calm nature does not mean you lack emotional depth either. In many cases, it means you process your deepest feelings privately, allowing them to settle inside you before you decide what they mean. You care about loyalty, responsibility, consistency, respect, and genuine value because those things give relationships substance, and when you take them seriously, you are often noticing a difference that other people would rather overlook. Your refusal to treat those values casually is not some flaw you need to apologize for. It speaks to a part of you that can sense when something has real weight and when something merely looks valuable from the outside. You have probably learned that lesson through experience, through the small moments when someone's words sounded reassuring, but their actions quietly moved in another direction. And because giving, helping, preserving, and showing up may have become so natural to you, you may not always stop to ask what those acts are costing you until you are already exhausted. You may even have spent a long time defending other people's intentions inside your own mind. Maybe you told yourself they did not mean to hurt you, or that you were being too serious about your principles, too particular about promises, or too unwilling to overlook something everyone else considered minor. Perhaps you wondered whether you should simply become more flexible, expect less, or let certain things pass without naming them. That private negotiation can keep you quiet for years because every time you question your own perception, the relationship gets another chance to remain unchanged while you absorb the discomfort. But understanding another person's limitations cannot require you to abandon your own emotional reality. Being strong enough to survive being taken for granted does not make the experience insignificant. There are people who spend years carrying responsibilities that seem to find their way into their hands simply because everyone knows they will handle them. And yet very few people stop to ask what happens when the dependable one finally becomes tired. You may have become so accustomed to being the one who manages, remembers, provides, repairs, and steadies the situation that others stop noticing how much energy it took for you to keep doing all of that. Think about that quietly for a moment. Has someone ever come toward you without needing anything from you, without another problem to solve, another favor to ask, or another responsibility to place in your hands, simply because they wanted to know how you were doing? Has someone ever recognized the care behind what you give instead of only noticing what you can provide? If that kind of recognition has been missing, then let yourself acknowledge that absence without immediately defending the people who created it, because sometimes being unseen for a long time becomes its own kind of exhaustion. Take a slow breath and allow the truth of that to have a little space. Breathing cannot erase what happened, and you do not need to pretend the past suddenly feels harmless. But your inner world needs somewhere the truth can exist without being minimized or buried beneath another obligation. You have carried this because you were capable of carrying it, yet capability should never become a reason that nobody has to care about your weight. What you have held deserves to be recognized before you can begin loosening your grip on it. And as that recognition settles more deeply, another layer of the story begins to come into view. The difficult realization is that the weight may not have come from only one person. Taurus, what hurts may be connected not only to the person who crossed a line, but also to someone within the family who was close enough to notice what was happening and still remained on the sidelines. That second layer can be especially difficult because it asks you to look at a different kind of betrayal, one that may have arrived through absence rather than action. Sometimes the person who wounds you directly is easier to understand than the person who saw the wound forming and never stepped closer. Betrayal does not always happen through someone's hands taking something from you. Sometimes it takes shape through a decision to stay quiet, to avoid discomfort, to preserve their own position, or simply to let events continue, because intervening would have required courage. That silence can be difficult to explain to yourself, because technically they may say they never attacked you, never took anything from you, and never spoke the words that caused the original harm. Yet when you needed someone to acknowledge what was happening, their absence may have communicated something you could feel even if nobody ever said it aloud. Imagine realizing that someone you considered an ally understood at least part of the effort behind what you had built, recognized how much certain values mattered to you, and still chose not to step forward when your position was being weakened. Perhaps they were uncertain about what to do, or perhaps they saw the situation differently. You may never know every reason behind their silence. But what remains emotionally significant is that when you were looking for evidence that someone stood with you, you did not experience their presence as protection, and that can leave you questioning far more than the event itself. You may know that feeling intimately. No dramatic confrontation is required for trust to change inside you. One person can create the original injury, while another person, through silence or passivity, leaves you feeling as though you had to defend your own reality alone. And for someone like you who may already prefer to preserve peace rather than create unnecessary conflict, that can be especially painful because you may have spent so much time wondering whether speaking up would only make everything worse. There is a difficult truth that often emerges when people reflect deeply on experiences like this. Sometimes the anger toward the person who caused the damage is easier to release than the hurt toward the person who watched it happen. You may eventually understand why the first person behaved as they did, even if you never excuse it. But forgiving the person who knew enough to recognize your pain and still remain silent can require you to work through an entirely different question. What did their silence make you believe about your own place in the relationship? I once heard an older woman describe something with a similar emotional shape. People within her own family had heard rumors questioning her finances and her character, and those closest to her knew enough about her life to understand that the accusations did not reflect the person they knew. Yet they stayed quiet, perhaps because speaking would have created tension, perhaps because they did not want to become involved, or perhaps because they simply chose the easier path. For her, that silence became more painful than the rumors themselves, because an accusation can come from someone who does not know you, while silence from someone who does can make you wonder whether the loyalty you offered was ever being held with the same care. And that may be the deeper place this touches in you, Taurus. You may not only be grieving what someone did, you may be grieving the version of belonging you believed existed between you because you thought certain people would recognize your effort without needing to be asked. When that expectation breaks, the heart can become very quiet, not because it has stopped feeling, but because it is trying to understand what kind of connection can actually hold the weight of your trust. Taurus, this may reach into a place inside you shaped for years by one quiet belief: keeping the peace is often better than disturbing the whole structure. You may have learned to overlook what could have been challenged, soften words that needed to be spoken, and absorb discomfort rather than risk becoming the person who created tension. You became skilled at keeping life steady, even when that steadiness required you to hide what was happening inside. But silence is not always harmless, simply because it feels peaceful. When silence allows harmful behavior to continue, it can become part of the pattern, and choosing not to respond is still a choice. Someone may never have openly acted against you, yet their refusal to acknowledge what was happening could still leave you feeling that they stood closer to the person undermining you than to the person who needed their support. As an earth sign, you understand how much patience it takes to create something dependable, whether that is a home, a family rhythm, a relationship, or simply a life that feels manageable. There is strength in your instinct to preserve what has been built, but it becomes a burden when others assume that your strength means you should tolerate whatever they place in your hands. Family harmony can slowly become an expectation that you will bend first, endure the longest, and wait until everyone else is comfortable before speaking honestly. Chaos drains you, Taurus, so sometimes you choose an uncomfortable peace, because at least the outside world still appears intact. Yet every time you absorb the consequences so someone else does not have to face them, people may begin assuming you can survive one more disappointment, one more broken promise, one more moment of being overlooked. Your patience can start looking like permission, while your ability to endure makes others forget that endurance has limits. Eventually, something inside you quietly says, "I cannot keep carrying this in the same way." You do not need a public confrontation for that realization to matter, and God does not need an argument to know what happened. The effort you gave, the responsibilities you carried, and the moments when you protected peace at your own expense remain real even when you chose to stay quiet. You are not being asked to make anyone suffer because you suffered. Retaliation will not restore the peace you were trying to protect. What matters is recognizing that a relationship you believed was mutual may not have been as balanced as you thought, and that recognition can help you loosen your attachment to what you wished it would become. You can acknowledge the imbalance without carrying resentment as another burden. Think about the family gatherings, conversations, favors, and ordinary moments when you showed up. How often did people notice what you could provide, before noticing how tired you were? How often did you speak from principle and leave wondering whether anyone truly heard you? Perhaps some part of you recognized this pattern long before you were ready to name it, because naming it felt dangerous when honesty might change the relationship. You may have feared being called controlling because you wanted accountability, or materialistic because you cared about fairness and respected what had taken years to build. So you negotiated with your own feelings, convincing yourself that preserving the relationship mattered more than admitting how much the relationship had changed. But this moment asked something different. Courage without hostility, honesty without revenge, and boundaries without punishment. You were allowed to say that something hurt you, that someone's silence changed your trust, and that accepting the same pattern would mean abandoning something important within yourself. You do not have to prove that another person is bad in order to recognize that their behavior was unhealthy for you. For a long time, the feeling of being undervalued may have followed you through ordinary family life, appearing again whenever you helped, even though something inside you whispered, "Not this time." You may have told yourself that generosity was simply who you were, while another part of you remembered how little protection or consideration you received when you needed someone beside you. You can begin setting that burden down without destroying anyone. Release can start quietly, with the decision to stop arguing against your own experience and to admit what you already know. And once you stop denying it, another question naturally rises. Why did you carry this wound for so long? You may have searched through your own choices, wondering whether you were too firm, too serious, or too demanding, simply because you expected commitments to mean something. Perhaps you responded by giving more, loosening boundaries, and becoming increasingly accommodating because some part of you hoped that changing yourself would restore the closeness you had lost. But generosity without reciprocity can slowly become an expectation. What began as love can start feeling like an obligation, leaving you with the same quiet question: why does giving more keep producing less closeness? The answer does not have to be that anyone hated you, and you do not need to assume you know everything happening inside them. Sometimes people simply respond differently to values they do not share, especially when another person's consistency makes those differences harder to ignore. You were willing to organize your life around principles, even when doing so required patience. You cared about consistency when convenience would have been easier, and you understood that something valuable needs care if it is going to last. Without intending to, your way of living may have revealed differences in values within your family, showing that responsibility, stability, and commitment did not carry the same meaning for everyone. And perhaps that is where this next layer becomes important, Taurus. The question is no longer whether you were wrong to value what you valued, but whether you can honor those values without continuing to sacrifice yourself just to keep an old structure standing. Sometimes the very qualities that helped you survive, your patience, loyalty, steadiness, and willingness to remain, can also make it difficult to recognize when something familiar has stopped giving you the security you once believed it offered. When people feel uncomfortable with qualities they have not developed in themselves, they can sometimes turn that discomfort toward the person who embodies them. I remember a woman who was always seen as the different child because she saved, planned, and thought carefully about the future instead of joining family drama or spending recklessly. What hurt most was not the labels of boring or cheap, but realizing that the values she lived by were being treated as flaws. Taurus, your relationship with value runs deeper than possessions. As an earth sign, you tend to notice what can be cultivated, protected, and made lasting through patience and care. You may have been misunderstood for your deliberate pace, with caution mistaken for fear and consistency for stubbornness, yet you have always wanted what you build to have substance. Still, not everyone is simply threatened by your strength. Sometimes there is a genuine difference in values, and sometimes your persistence can keep you in relationships longer than your heart can comfortably sustain. You may have spoken less, carried more, and absorbed disappointment because preserving peace seemed easier than creating another rupture. When you finally withdrew, others may have called you stubborn, materialistic, distant, or difficult to reach. But those labels do not have to become your identity. Your practicality and concern for fairness are qualities worth honoring, while your deeper lesson may be learning when those strengths need flexibility, and when preserving stability means asking whether the structure you are protecting still gives you room to breathe and feel respected. You have endured enough moments where you gave more than you received and then questioned yourself for noticing the imbalance. After disappointment, you did not need to destroy anyone or become consumed by resentment. You quietly began rebuilding your life around what felt honest and sustainable, even without an apology. Yet some people may never offer the explanation or recognition you hoped would make the past easier to understand, and waiting for that moment can keep part of you tied to what has already happened. Dear Taurus, your ability to rebuild patiently is a gift. But endurance becomes heavy when you keep waiting for someone to provide what they have repeatedly shown they cannot give. Forgiveness, when it feels right for you, does not mean pretending the harm was acceptable. It means refusing to let the old wound keep occupying the space where your peace belongs. Think of a field that has been tended for years. When part of the soil becomes exhausted, you do not force it to produce endlessly. You allow it to rest, receive care, and be tended differently. Ask yourself gently, do I deserve peace of mind? You have carried this wound through difficult conversations, quiet nights, and moments when you chose stability over saying everything you felt. You were allowed to put some of that weight down, not because the past becomes unimportant, but because you no longer need to carry its unanswered questions everywhere you go. Have you ever wondered, if I let go, will I lose them forever? Sometimes what you release is not the person, but the expectation that they will finally become the person you needed them to be. You do not have to hold a relationship together alone simply because you once believed loyalty meant enduring whatever came your way. You deserve connections where your effort is noticed, your boundaries are respected, and what you give is met with genuine reciprocity. You do not need anyone to certify your worth, and you do not need them to change before you begin choosing differently. Your ground becomes steadier when you stop asking yourself to carry what was never yours alone to hold. Dear Taurus, sit quietly for a moment and ask, did I truly lose those people, or did I finally release something that no longer treated my presence with care? There is a difference between being alone and being surrounded by people who leave you feeling unseen. Some may share your blood yet never ask whether you are tired, whether you need support, or whether anyone has remembered to appreciate what you have carried. Then, there are people you may not have known for long, who recognize something familiar in the way you move through the world. They do not approach you because they need something. They simply know how to sit beside you without disturbing your peace. That kind of connection can feel profound for Taurus, because you are not looking for constant excitement or reassurance. You are looking for something steady enough that your shoulders can finally relax. You have a deep relationship with what is real, Taurus. You notice whether words become actions, whether affection has consistency behind it, and whether a relationship can carry weight when life becomes difficult. Your patience and perseverance are part of your nature, but they also ask you to become more discerning about where those qualities belong. Not every connection deserves the same investment, simply because you have the capacity to keep tending it. Imagine a man who spent years surrounded by family conflict before choosing a quieter life of his own. He grows vegetables, enjoys peaceful afternoons outside, and appreciates the ordinary rhythm of his days. Then a younger neighbor he barely knows begins bringing him a warm loaf of bread each week, not because they share a long history, but because genuine care does not always need years to become meaningful. That simple act can carry more emotional weight than years of help that came with expectations attached. This is another way to understand family, Taurus. Family does not have to be where you swallow your feelings, clean up what others leave behind, or make yourself smaller for everyone's comfort. It can be the space where you breathe naturally, where your silence is not mistaken for weakness, and where your presence is valued without requiring you to prove what you can provide. You have not failed because some relationships could not meet you there. You do not need to believe every future connection is guaranteed to arrive at the perfect moment to trust that healthier relationships are possible. What matters is learning to recognize them through what they consistently demonstrate: respect, reliability, generosity, without hidden conditions, and the freedom to be yourself without remaining on guard. You are not defined by the labels others placed on you. You are not simply stubborn because you need time to process change, nor materialistic because you care about responsibility, security, and the value of what you have created. You understand that trust is built gradually, that loyalty has weight, and that love becomes meaningful through what people repeatedly choose to do. There may come a moment when you realize you no longer need to stand inside an old structure simply because you were once the person holding it together. You may have wondered, if I step away, who will keep everything from falling apart? But perhaps that question was part of the burden itself. You are allowed to make room for a different foundation, one where responsibility is shared, care moves in both directions, and you do not have to ask permission to be valued. And if someone from the past ever returns with genuine respect, you can meet that moment with clearer eyes. You will not need to decide from old fear, loyalty, or the hope of finally receiving the apology you once waited for. You can observe what is actually present and let their actions speak. Peace can matter more than proving who was right, while your sense of belonging becomes rooted less in who claims you as family and more in who consistently makes room for you.